Imagine this. You're working on a construction project and accidentally damage a client's property. Without insurance, you could be held responsible for the repair costs. And what about the unforeseen accidents that can happen on a job site? Construction projects come with their fair share of risks. If a third party gets injured, you could be facing medical expenses, legal fees, or even potential settlements. But with construction liability insurance, those expenses are covered, saving you from a significant financial burden. So, if you're a general contractor, renovation expert, or construction professional, don't leave your business vulnerable. Nail down the low-cost construction liability insurance you need and get a certificate of insurance quickly. And get a free quote now by visiting zensurance.com/save35. Zensurance is Canada's leading source for small business and construction liability insurance. Hello and welcome to the Construction Record Podcast. I'm digital media editor Warren Frey. Today we have an interview with Terry Brown of STBR Consulting and Katy Fairley of Fairley Strategies about CCDC documentation and new changes involving Ready For Takeover, a new project milestone. But before we get to that, here's some of the latest news headlines from both the Daily Commercial News and the Journal of Commerce. We've just put out a story about an advocacy report from People for Education knocking Ontario's plan to create a pathway for high school students to enter apprenticeships after they've completed grade 10. Some construction stakeholders are slamming the report for not understanding the growth that takes place through the apprenticeship cycle, while others said the report raised important issues and that they also want more details about the government plan. We also have a story where the Toronto Community Benefits Network is asking if community benefits are a priority for the Ontario line, a 15.6-kilometre subway line that will add 15 new stations to the city. At a recent town hall meeting it hosted, TCBN raised the issue that while 2 contracts have been awarded, no mention of community benefits has been made. And in project news, the City of Kitchener expects to put out a tender this summer for a new $14 million public library, which will draw all of its energy from renewable sources that include solar panels and geothermal technology. The Southwest Public Library project is a single-story, 14,000 square foot structure that will be designed to meet net zero energy carbon building standards and exceed the highest accessibility standards as well. From the West, we recently posted a story about PCL employee Mike Enter, who recently reached the summit of Mount Everest. He said without the support of PCL Constructors Inc., he would have never made it. Also, after 6 years, the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, Local 213, has received a positive ruling against Leadcore Technical Services for the implementation of a collective agreement. The Canadian Industrial Relations Board ruled in favor of IBEW's version of a collective bargaining agreement between the union and LTS Solutions Limited, accepting all the union's proposals except the duration of the agreement. And in project news, the government of British Columbia announced the beginning of construction of a new overpass on Highway 17, which is anticipated to increase safety on one of Vancouver Island's most important transportation corridors. The Highway 17 Keating Crossroad Flyover project has a budget of $76.8 million. The province is contributing $57.6 million, the Government of Canada is contributing $16.7 million, and the District of Central Sandwich is putting $2.5 million into the project. And that's it for the news. Up next, Katy Fairley and Terry Brown talk CCDC. With me today I have...
I'm Katy Fairley. I'm principal with Fairley Strategies, and I'm also a consultant with the BC Construction Association on their standard practices file.
And?
My name is Terry Brown. I'm with my own company called STBR Consulting Limited, and I've been involved in construction for half a century plus.
Okay, and we're here today to talk about CCDC and some new permutations thereof. Maybe Terry or Katy or both of you, can you explain to me what CCDC is? Because I understand it the least of anybody on this call. I guarantee you, and sort of how it works into the industry.
Right. So that's a good question. CCDC, Canadian Construction Document Committee, was formed in 1974. There's 18 people that sit around the table. There are 4 owners, 2 public owners and 2 private owners. There are 3 architects. There are 4 contractors, 3 general contractors and a trade contractor. There are 3 spec writers and there are 3 engineers. And there's a legal professional who gives advice to CCDC on recent court cases on appropriate language, et cetera, et cetera. And those are the major players in our industry in Canada. They came together half a century ago to try and standardize documents across Canada. Mm-hmm. And so that was when it was formed. All the parties sit at the table. Those parties discuss every document that comes out, all the contracts, and make sure that each party understands the other party's points of view, concerns, et cetera, et cetera. And then when the document comes out, it is a consensus document among those key players of our industry. And so it's a bit unique in the world in that Canada was the first and one of the very few where all the parties of the industry actually sit down at a table and get one standardized document. Most countries, each specialized group writes their own contract, like in the USA, the owners, the consultants, the architects, the engineers, the contractors, each have their own, and there's no standardized contracts across the country. So Canada is unique and has been a model actually for a number of other countries.
Okay, and I should stress, none of us are lawyers on this call, but I would assume this is helpful in a legal sense because people can all refer to the same thing as opposed to extra layers of complication.
Exactly. Governments and legal cases look to the CCDC documents as industry best practice, as standards, because they're used C to C to C across all 13 jurisdictions. CCDC sells probably close to 60,000 CCDC2 contracts, probably 2/3 of a million statutory declarations. They are universally used, universally recognized throughout Canada.
Okay, and Katy, you deal with this on the ground in your consulting company. You try to get people on board with CCDC, I assume. So maybe you could talk about what are maybe some of the stumbling blocks and what are some of the things that people completely jump onto when they see CCDC documents.
I think Terry addressed that really well. This sets a standard, a baseline, so that people, when they are negotiating contracts, when contractors are deciding whether or not to pursue a project, they know that starting point. Even within the realm of the CCDC contracts, it is appropriate to add in additional kind of project-specific requirements, either in a in a Division 01 aspect, which CCDC also has a standard form that people can start with, and then also potentially modifying via supplementary conditions as well. But I'd maybe caution your listeners, Warren, at some point along the way, owners in particular started to view, or they now view CCDC contracts as contractor friendly. And I don't know at what point fair and balanced now means contractor friendly, but as Terry said, these are consensus driven documents that aim to allocate risk and responsibilities to the party that within that delivery method and that corresponding CCDC contract are best able to manage them.
Okay. Now there's a new feature, or I'm assuming it's new, called Ready For Takeover. So maybe both of you could explain what that is to me and what it does and what it addresses that wasn't addressed before.
Very good point. So for decades, we mixed the two requirements in a contract. There is the statutory requirements of each jurisdiction, and then there are the contractual requirements. And we kind of stuck them together for the last decades and decades. And when I was on CCDC for over 16 years. I was actually at the table when we discussed these matters. And what was happening was that the owners were adding more and more conditions on the contractual side that were not required on the statutory side. So they kept saying, well, we want this and we want this and we want this. And would say, yeah, but our law doesn't require that. And right now, our contract says that whatever the statutory requirements are is when we achieve substantial performance of the work. So collectively, we agreed to separate those two milestones, the one that's required by law and the one that the two parties agree to in their contractual terms and conditions. And so we separated them now. Now we just call substantial performance of the work as whatever the lien legislation says. And we introduced this new term called Ready For Takeover, which is when you're ready to turn the building over to the owner, when that moment in time, when the care, custody, and control moves from the contractor to the owner. And so we call that ready for takeover, and it's a contractual obligations. So I can meet my statutory obligations in one milestone, but if I agree to a bunch of other conditions, as-built and manuals, working drawings, education and training, balancing reports, those are contractual terms.
Mm-hmm.
And that's separate from what the law requires. The law doesn't require all those little nuances that many contractors require. So at CCDC, we very clearly separated what the law requires and what the two parties have agreed with their contract language, the terms and conditions of that contract. So there's this distinct separation. And what our industry is finding, and Katy will expand on this, is that it's a new way of doing business. We haven't done it this way for decades. We've always combined what the law required and what the contract required. Now they're totally separate. So it's a mind shift. It's a shift in concept to owners, to contractors, to consultants, to trades. There's now more distinctly articulated two separate milestones in the life of a project. Whatever the law says and whatever you've agreed to in your contract terms and conditions. And those two milestones could be a year apart or more in a complex job. And the advantage, it benefits both parties. When we were sitting around the table, we discussed what the pros and cons of this separation would be. And it really advantages both parties. From the contractor's perspective, once those two milestones were separated, then he can apply statutorily for the release of his holdback, that 10% that's required by law to be held back. He may not be finished all his contractual obligations, but he can start the clock ticking for the release of that 10% holdback. And on a $10 million job, that's $1 million. On $100 million, it's $10 million. So the contractor needs that. Cash is king, cash flow is critical, and he wants that money out as soon as possible. So this separation benefits the contractors by more clearly articulating the two milestones. But it also benefits the owners because now they can really clarify exactly what they need before they take the building over. Are all the life safety conditions in place? Do I have the fire alarm verification? Do I have the as-built and manuals enough to operate the building? Is the training of being scheduled? Our buildings today are so sophisticated, zero energy, smart thermostats, sensors everywhere, pumps that shut off and on, economizers, dampers, and they're extremely complex. And when the buildings turn over, the owner rightly needs to know exactly how to operate this brand new facility. So it benefits the owners because now contractually, they can say, yeah, we understand you've met the terms and conditions of the requirements of the law, but we need a bunch more specifics before we can appropriately run this building. So it's this shift in mindset from having combined the two milestones for decades to now distinctly separating them. And it really affects everybody. And they're really having trouble wrapping their minds around it. There's a lot of education going on. CCDC is putting out educations, associations, regional associations, putting on educational sessions. You can certainly tie into your local construction association, but it's a new learning, a new way of doing business with this very distinct separation of what the law requires and what the contract requires.
Right, Katy, you're going to expand on that, but also I think we all know that the words "a new way of doing business" and "construction" are not the friendliest words to put together. They've gotten better, but it's still not an industry where like a new thing, great. so how do you encounter that? I'm sure you do encounter that, and then how do you kind of get past that when you're talking to your clients?
So Warren, I think you hit the nail on the head both ways. One, we still talk about a contract that's 2.5 years old and the new concept. I just did it myself as new. This is a contract that's been out almost coming up on 3 years, and yet it's still new. For me, talking to contractors and owners, not a lot of folks have closed out a project yet under this contract. People are very much married to the way they've always done business. People are familiar with the 2008 version, like you said. But for Terry and I think other folks that are more familiar with this contract, have been reading a lot about it. It's really not the same, like Terry said, except for talking to contractors in particular. They think it's just a new number attached to the back end of a CCDC contract. They're not aware of just the impact of that. And I think Terry's right. There's benefits to both major parties in that contract. One, the owner, they want their asset, and the contractor wants their holdback money. And I think what's important for contractors and owners to realize is that you could be statutorily, correct, compliant, while at the same time being offside with your contract because you haven't achieved that major milestone as stated in the contract by that date for Ready for Takeover. So that I think that's our industry doesn't like change. You're completely right. And we're going to see, though, this concept of Ready for Takeover. I think it's definitely going to flow through the rest of the CCDC contracts. And I think even just, let's say bespoke construction contracts that might otherwise be used. That's like Terry said, these CCDC contracts have a way of influencing, every other construction contract in Canada.
Okay, and finally, people can obviously tell you're both experts on this. Where should people go to find, to talk to you, email you, and find out more about this contractual language? Consult specifically your expertise.
Well, I think one is going to be reaching out to your local construction associations. They have been for across Canada for now going on 2-3 years, providing courses, providing training on this. One thing, always read your contract, and I think don't assume that because you're bidding or pursuing a project with an owner and you've read that contract and their supplementary conditions a million times in the past, things have changed. I've heard stories now of contractors that didn't read the new CCDC2 and those supplementaries and bid and won a project only to realize that, for instance, they don't have the right insurance coverage now. And that, on a smaller project, that could be your profit. And I think kind of on that, if you'll indulge me a little bit, Warren,
sure,
in something of a rant, with the advent of the new CCDC2 2020, I think it's been a field day for those folks who write supplementary conditions to the standard contracts. The base CCDC2 is 28 pages long. I've read 45 pages of additional terms and conditions that delete, replace, add to a standard contract. So, we're talking specifically about the Ready for Takeover milestone. Some of the language that I've read, and these are from public sector owners, they are making that Ready for Takeover means the resolution of any known defects and deficiencies are completed entirely. Like, you're now talking about total or final completion of a project. That is definitely not CCDC's intent when they created this new milestone. So if you're a contractor, you better read into those supplementaries to understand that when you're signing a contract, that you're signing it for really that final completion aspect as well. So and I think, the other big one that we're seeing is, and I don't know if we've got time for Terry to expand on it.
Go for it.
Okay, but it is the clause within the GC language. So sorry, it's GC 12.1, ready for takeover, and there's a subclause to that that says that if the contractor is unable to fulfill, I think it's 4 items, that ready for takeover will not be unreasonably denied, because those 4 items are not within their control. And we're seeing that clause wholesale deleted. And my point to owners is you're really tying the hands of your project management team, because, are they really going to force a contractor into really default because, of what would otherwise be, items outside of the contractor's control potentially. So, the devil's in the details. We talked about CCDC's consensus driven. It's fair and balanced, but these supplementary conditions are distorting and morphing these contracts into something that can be highly, highly onerous. From my own opinion, there's no such thing as 15, 30 plus pages of supplementaries. And page length matters. Like it really does.
And, following up on what Katie said on these massive pages of supplementary conditions, it puts contractors in a tough position. They basically, to oversimplify it, they have 2 options. One is to not bid the work, which doesn't benefit the owner. And the other is to add in a ton of risk money in order to appropriately manage all the risk that's been transferred. So that messes the owners both ways, right? They think they're helping themselves by writing 30, 40, 50 pages of supplementary conditions, but they don't get the bids. A lot of good players walk away from owners' conditions. And those that bid understand they've got a ton of risk and that they are going to have to manage that risk. And one of the ways is to put a whack of money in your bid. There was a project here in Kelowna, public project, the budget was 5.5 million. There were a lot of less than reasonable supplementary conditions. They got 2 bids, one at 16 million and one at 18 million. Right. And so the project doesn't proceed. Nobody wins. So there are, there are unintended consequences of all of those supplementary conditions.
And I think, Warren, the other hit to it when you have these onerous contract clauses is what is that going to do for the relationship? I really think that the best projects are where, the contract goes in the drawer and it goes so smoothly that, you're not referring to it. That's not to say it doesn't exist, but that just speaks to the relationship between the parties. But, I don't think that should be discounted of just on a personal level, when you're in those sorts of, tough situations in construction, just personally, how much that can impact the project, the team, even the person going home, at night. So, I appreciate maybe that owners are being advised to modify these documents, to mitigate and manage their perceived risk. But I think it's at what cost? And I think, everybody would be well served to really put the project first. But a lot of owners talk about collaboration, and then you read into their contract documents, and that's the least of what they're implying and putting out there to industry.
Okay, well, I think that's a good place to stop it. Some cynicism. Thank you, Katie, and thank you, Terry.
Thank you, Warren.
Quite welcome. Thanks, Warren.
Thanks, Katie, and thanks, Terry. Now it's time for our latest economic news. Be sure to check out Dmitry Konovalov's Global Market Scan article about the bright infrastructure horizon coming to the Indian subcontinent. Konovalov says the combination of population growth and increased GDP means sustainable expansion. Further infrastructure implementation, he says, will have a self-propelling effect. Back home in Canada, the national office vacancy rate climbed in the second quarter to its highest level since 1994, according to a report from commercial real estate firm CBRE. They say the national office vacancy rate rose to 18.1% in the second quarter, up from 17.8% in the first quarter. It's the highest level since the first quarter of 1994 when it was 18.6%. We also have a recent column by Construct Connect chief economist Alex Carrick looking at where the jobs are that are driving the U.S. unemployment rate so low, with a series of graphics breaking down that very question. And make sure to tune into our previous Construction Record podcast episode, which features both Alex and Construct Connect senior economist Michael Gooks. If you'd like to hear other episodes of the Construction Record podcast, you can listen to us on Amazon Music, Apple Music, and Spotify, as well as on the Daily Commercial News and Journal of Commerce websites. And of course, for every story we've mentioned in the economic and news segment, we have links in the show notes. Thanks for listening.